My next patron question is from Micah, who wanted to know about the possible future for a popular superhero involved in a certain Hollywood split. Could any good come from Sony being in full control of Spider-Man now that he will no longer be in the MCU? As quite a few people are aware, Disney and Sony cannot come to an agreement regarding the financial arrangement for Spider-Man appearing in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Kevin Feige continuing to serve as a producer on the current live-action Spider-Man movies. There have been multiple articles written on the subject from trusted trade publications, but each of them is presenting wildly different information as to why the arrangement fell apart. So I'm not going to go into the whole profit percentages thing because we're not getting a straight answer on exactly how much the studios were bargaining. Now, I don't think this is the end. I have a hunch that Feige wanted to continue to use Spidey in the future Marvel movies and wanted to continue to have a say in his next solo adventures. He appears to have a lot of sway at Disney, so I have a theory he will use that to bring everyone back to the bargaining table. But if Sony and Disney don't come to an agreement, the big question comes from how to address the lack of MCU references in the future sequels. Tom Holland will still be playing Peter Parker, and we'll still see Aunt May, MJ, Ned, Flash Thompson, and other characters Sony is allowed to use. But no Tony Stark, who drove a lot of Peter's character development in Homecoming and Far From Home. A lot of people wondering about that, but that whole arc kind of ended in the last movie. The lack of Tony Stark, thus, is not really a problem. Nick Fury would not be able to show up, but he wasn't in Homecoming, so not too big of a deal. Happy Hogan and the rest of the Avengers are a tad more tricky to ignore, but I think you can write around them. What I liked most about those two Spider-Man movies was the high school comedy aspect, and seeing Peter juggle his teenage life and superhero life, and I assume the next film will continue that as he possibly prepares for graduation. Far From Home also ended in a way that gives the filmmakers an interesting new angle to develop Peter's growth into becoming a full-fledged superhero. Screenwriters Chris McKenna and Eric Summers will already sign on to write the next Spider-Man movie, so I imagine they have a general idea of how to continue Peter's story. Something important I do want to bring up is the perception going around that Disney did all the work on the Spider-Man movies, but those were actually still Sony productions. Sony was responsible for the budget, they had director cast and script approval, had final cut privilege, and handled the distribution and marketing. The films were almost entirely paid for by Sony Pictures, while Kevin Feige was essentially loaned to the production, along with Sony being given permission to use the MCU characters and references. In exchange, Disney was then allowed to incorporate Spider-Man into Captain America's Civil War and the Avengers movies. There is a curiosity regarding the possible quality of the future Spider-Man movies without Marvel's involvement, but Sony has proven they are more than capable of doing so. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was a great movie that cleverly utilized the various incarnations of Spidey, including Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy. A lot of people loved it, and there are so many possibilities the filmmakers can take the sequels. I recently revisited Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies, and I think they hold up very well. I personally regard Spider-Man 2 as one of the best superhero movies, with top-notch action, an excellent villain, and great character development for Peter Parker. I also find Spider-Man 3 to be rather underrated. I understand why it's not particularly loved, but Raimi still brought his directing prowess to the table, and having Peter struggle with containing his ego was an interesting story direction. I do grant that the Amazing Spider-Man movies could have been better, but I don't think they should take away from the really good Spider-Man movies Sony did produce. One funny claim I keep seeing is that the highly regarded Spider-Man movies, like Sam Raimi's first two entries, had no creative say from Sony whatsoever. You're telling me that Sony spent hundreds of millions of dollars making movies that they positioned as major summer tentpoles and just let Raimi do everything he wanted? Yep, that's totally how Hollywood works. I've even seen the claim that Into the Spider-Verse turned out so good because Sony focused all their attention on the Emoji Movie, even though they spent $40 million more on Spider-Verse. In fact, if you listen to the audio commentary track of Spider-Verse, the filmmakers frequently mention the notes and suggestions from executives, including Sony Pictures head Tom Rothman, that made it into the finished film. So to conclude, I don't agree with the narrative that Sony is keeping Spider-Man hostage. They acquired the film rights to the character 20 years ago, and have done their job of producing multiple movies with Spider-Man in the years since. Most of them have been well received, and with Tom Holland continuing in the role for the next film, I have no doubt the third film will remain a box office force. And we also have more Spider-Verse on the way. I look forward to seeing where Sony takes the web crawler next. Thank you for your question, Micah.